Life inside Leavenworth, the brutal reality of America's oldest federal prison. The sun hadn't risen yet over Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, but the building was already awake. The massive stone fortress, built in 1906 and known for its castle-like design, sat under a pale blue sky, its towers looming like watchful sentinels. Fog clung to the razor wire along the perimeter fence, rolling across the yard like slow-moving smoke. For more than a century, this place had been home to some of the most difficult moments in American prison history. But what investigators were about to uncover would reveal a side of the prison few ever understood. It began with something small. A routine inspection, the kind officers had done thousands of times, inside one of the older housing units. A floor officer noticed that a piece of wall paneling near a metal bunk felt loose. When he pressed his hand against it, the panel shifted just slightly, more than it should have. Behind it, hidden in a narrow cavity, was a folded envelope that shouldn't have been there. At first, it looked harmless, just a worn piece of paper with faded ink. But when investigators opened it, they found a list of names, a series of coded markings, and notes about scheduled movement inside the prison. The content didn't describe anything violent or explicit, but it clearly reflected information no inmate should have had access to. In a place like Leavenworth, even small details, who moved where, who worked which shift, which inmates were being transferred, could shift the balance of tension across entire cell blocks. So the discovery set off immediate alarms. To outsiders, life inside Leavenworth seemed rigid, controlled, and predictable. Massive stone walls, echoing hallways, timed routines. But officers knew that beneath the surface of order, pressures were always building, shaped by decades of overcrowding, contraband issues, inmate alliances, and the constant push and pull between security and adaptation. The hidden envelope hinted at something deeper, and investigators needed answers. They began interviewing inmates who had lived in the unit. Most said nothing. Some claimed they'd never seen the envelope before. Others shrugged, insisting that messages move in ways you don't see. It wasn't enough for a clear answer, but it wasn't unusual. Leavenworth had always been a place where information flowed quietly, through looks, gestures, subtle exchanges, or coded words. What investigators didn't know yet was that this discovery would connect to a much larger story, one that stretched across decades. Two major incidents in Leavenworth's history shaped what investigators now feared they were seeing again. The first took place in 1995, when a federal investigation revealed that certain staff members had been quietly smuggling contraband into the prison. It wasn't a single rogue employee or a dramatic conspiracy. It was a slow accumulation of small favors, small breaches, and small moments where judgment gave way to pressure. When the investigation became public, it sent shockwaves through the entire federal system. Policies were rewritten. Oversight tightened. Officers reassigned. But even after reforms, Leavenworth remained a place where adaptation was a survival skill, for staff and inmates alike. Then came 2008, another major turning point. Authorities investigating suspicious communication found a coordinated contraband network operated by inmates who used coded notes and discreet outside contacts to move information. The messages weren't dramatic or explicit, just carefully structured instructions, disguised in legal mail or written with subtle symbols that blended into routine paperwork. It became one of the prison's most important cases, proving how resourceful inmates could be, even under strict oversight. Now, as investigators looked at the envelope found behind the wall panel, they recognized familiar signs. Someone had been communicating, quietly, carefully, without drawing attention. And the note wasn't the only clue. Over the next week, officers found worn floor tiles, small indentations behind lockers, and at least 2 envelopes routed through the mailroom with unusual handwriting. Each detail on its own meant nothing, but together, they created a picture investigators couldn't ignore. Someone inside the prison was gathering information. Someone was moving messages through channels that weren't supposed to exist. Someone understood how to exploit the oldest weaknesses of the oldest federal prison in the country. As the investigation expanded, officers reviewed surveillance logs, mailroom records, and staffing rotations. They mapped the housing unit where the envelope had been found. They compared handwriting samples. They traced old routines, simple things like who cleaned what area, who escorted which inmate, who processed which letter. The deeper they went, the more Leavenworth's history seemed to echo through the walls. For decades, the prison had struggled with overcrowding. It had weathered disputes between inmate groups, internal corruption cases, and the constant challenge of controlling contraband in a building not designed for modern communication monitoring. Every era left behind a footprint, patterns, vulnerabilities, small openings that someone always learned to use. And now the patterns were resurfacing. One morning, while reviewing archived records in a cramped administrative office, an investigator noticed something that made the room fall silent. A reference line on the envelope found behind the wall matched a notation from a 2008 case file. Not an exact match, but close enough to hint at a connection. For the first time, investigators realized they might not be dealing with a new problem. They might be dealing with an old one resurfacing, an adaptation of earlier methods used by different individuals over different eras, shaped by the same environment, the same pressures, and the same hidden pathways that had always existed inside Leavenworth. And then came the turning point. While searching storage records, an officer found a locked maintenance cabinet in the same housing unit where the envelope was discovered. The cabinet hadn't been opened in months. When they forced it open, what they found inside changed the entire direction of the investigation. The metal cabinet groaned as the lock gave way, the sound echoing through the empty tier. Dust drifted from the hinges like the place itself exhaled. Inside, officers expected to find old cleaning supplies, broken tools, or forgotten paperwork. Instead, they found 3 sealed envelopes, each tucked inside a plastic maintenance container. None were addressed. None were stamped. And none belonged anywhere near inmate-accessible areas. The envelopes looked ordinary, standard issue, beige with clean edges, but there was something about them that made the investigators step back. They resembled the same style used in 2008, when authorities uncovered coded messages disguised in legal mail. Back then, investigators learned that certain inmates had intentionally used neutral envelopes, hoping to blend into everything else processed by the mailroom. These envelopes had that same unsettling simplicity. Each one was gently pulled out and placed in evidence bags. Inside the first envelope, investigators found a list of names, some belonging to inmates currently at Leavenworth, others to individuals who had been transferred months earlier. Next to each name was a series of small marks and abbreviations. Nothing explicit, nothing describing violence or wrongdoing, but it was clear someone was tracking movement and activity inside the institution. Inside the second envelope was something more concerning. It contained references to scheduled work assignments, staff shift rotations, and block access hours, information that shouldn't have left administrative logs. There was no sign of exploitation or criminal plotting, but the presence of internal schedules inside an unassigned envelope raised serious questions about how the information got there. The third envelope held only a single sheet of paper. A grid of numbers. No explanation, no names. Just rows of handwritten figures arranged with calculated precision. Investigators didn't know what it meant, not yet. The warden ordered an immediate internal review. Staff access logs were checked. Maintenance schedules were pulled. A team was assigned to analyze whether these envelopes had been intentionally hidden or accidentally misplaced during an earlier procedure. No one wanted to jump to conclusions, but the timing, the location, and the content raised concerns impossible to ignore. Leavenworth was no stranger to internal investigations. The 1995 corruption scandal, which uncovered staff bringing contraband into the facility, had taught administrators a painful lesson about blind spots. Even small breaches could create ripple effects. The prison structure, its age, its routines, its long-standing operational culture, made it vulnerable to subtle shifts in behavior. And the 2008 case, when inmates orchestrated a coordinated communication ring through coded notes, proved that messages didn't have to look dangerous to be dangerous. They only had to move quietly. Now the cabinet added a new variable. Over the next several days, investigators interviewed staff who had access to the maintenance corridor. None recognized the envelopes. Some hadn't opened that cabinet in months. Others insisted they only used it for tools or cleaning rags. One officer mentioned that the cabinet key had been misplaced earlier in the year and then found days later in a supply drawer. At the time, no one questioned it. Now they did. The envelopes were sent to the regional forensic lab, where analysts compared handwriting samples and ink composition to past Leavenworth cases. Meanwhile, investigators focused on the grid of numbers found in the third envelope. Patterns emerged slowly, certain numbers aligned with earlier movement logs. Others matched housing unit rotations from months prior. It wasn't a code in the criminal sense, more like someone tracking administrative rhythms, the pulsing heartbeat of the prison. To find out, investigators expanded the search to surrounding corridors. Behind another piece of loose paneling, they found remnants of shredded paper. In a supply closet, they found an outdated inmate roster with handwritten notes in the margins. In the mailroom, one officer recalled receiving an envelope weeks earlier that had no return address, but the handwriting looked similar. None of it pointed to a dramatic conspiracy. Instead, it hinted at something more complex, an information culture inside Leavenworth that had evolved over decades. In a prison with such deep history, communication didn't always move through official channels. Sometimes it moved through habits, routines, and quiet workarounds built over generations. One investigator described it this way: Leavenworth isn't just a building. It's a system that remembers everything. As the investigation widened, another discovery added urgency. A staff member reviewing old storage spaces found a binder from the early 2000s containing documented patterns of inmate communication, patterns eerily similar to those resurfacing now. Some notations matched the markings found on the name list in the first envelope. Others aligned with the patterns from the 2008 case. The realization hit hard. The envelopes in the cabinet were not unique. They were part of a continuum, a long-running adaptation by inmates who learned how to track the institution around them: movement, timing, opportunity. Not for violence, not for escape, but to understand the rhythms of a place where knowledge was power. Investigators began to consider an unsettling possibility. Someone inside the prison had been documenting administrative patterns for years. Maybe out of habit. Maybe out of interest. Maybe as part of a structure not yet fully understood. But the true breakthrough came late one evening. A facility officer reviewing storage room access logs noticed something odd. A specific staff badge number appeared multiple times near the maintenance corridor, on days when the envelopes were likely placed inside the cabinet. The staff member was well regarded, with no prior concerns, but they worked a shift that often placed them alone in certain hallways. When investigators quietly interviewed the individual, they learned something unexpected. The staff member routinely stored old inspection paperwork in the cabinet because there wasn't enough room in the main file closet. They didn't remember the envelopes. They didn't recall seeing anything unusual. But they mentioned that certain inmates assigned to cleaning duties had passed through the corridor over the past year. When investigators checked those assignments, a startling pattern emerged. At least one inmate assigned to that area had previously been involved, as a minor figure, in the 2008 communication case. Someone who understood how to track information. Someone who knew subtle methods. Someone who didn't need dramatic means to move messages. But when investigators pulled his current logs, they found something even more unsettling. He had been transferred weeks before the envelope was discovered, which raised one question stronger than all the others. If he wasn't the one who placed the envelopes, then who was? The revelation hit the investigation team like a cold wind. The inmate they initially suspected had already been transferred out of Leavenworth by the time the envelopes were hidden. Whatever had happened inside that maintenance corridor wasn't tied to a single person. It was tied to a system older than most of the staff working there. The team gathered in a small administrative office overlooking the yard. The room was cluttered with old filing cabinets, maps pinned to corkboards, and stacks of evidence bags. For weeks they had been following threads that seemed to lead somewhere, only to twist back into the building's history. But now those threads started converging. One investigator placed the 3 envelopes on the table, careful not to disturb the evidence seals. Another spread out copies of old documents from 2008 and even earlier. Handwriting samples, movement logs, coded notations, none of it pointed to one person. Instead, it pointed to a technique, a quiet way of documenting the flow of prison life that had resurfaced again and again. Whoever did this understood timing, one officer said. Not access. Timing. They reviewed the old inmate assignment logs, checking cleaning detail rotations, corridor access records, and staff movement. The maintenance corridor wasn't high security. It didn't require special clearance. It was simply an area where routine work happened out of sight. Anyone who understood the rhythm of the prison, shifts, patrol patterns, noise levels, could slip inside unnoticed for a few moments. It didn't take long for investigators to realize that the envelopes could have been placed there by different individuals at different times, all using the same methods without ever meeting each other. That was how patterns survived in places like Leavenworth, not through one mastermind, but through repetition, habit, and lessons passed quietly from one generation of inmates to the next. Still, the investigation needed something concrete. The breakthrough came when a senior records officer arrived with a stack of old administrative logs. They contained maintenance requests, corridor cleaning schedules, and paperwork complaints from staff dating back more than a decade. Buried within that stack was a curious detail. For years, small items, pencils, scraps of paper, and occasionally folded notes, had been found inside cracks or behind panels in older housing units. They were always dismissed as clutter or accidental drops. But the pattern was unmistakable. These weren't randomly hidden objects. They were places to stash information temporarily, a practice that stretched back long before the current investigation. As the team connected historical events, they realized something deeper. Every major incident at Leavenworth, the 1995 corruption case, the 2008 communication ring, and even minor administrative concerns scattered across years, had one thing in common. Information moved in ways the institution never fully anticipated. Not necessarily for violent or dangerous purposes, but as a means of navigating an environment where knowledge was limited and highly valued. The more they understood, the clearer the picture became. Someone had continued this tradition, documenting schedules, movements, and administrative rhythms, not to cause harm, but possibly as a form of leverage or strategy inside the institution. In an environment shaped by tension and uncertainty, information was a survival mechanism. But one question remained unanswered. Who placed the 3 envelopes? Investigators narrowed down staff and inmate access windows. They interviewed maintenance workers. They reviewed surveillance angles that didn't fully cover the corridor. And then, something subtle emerged. If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it.